a devastating landslide in Papua New Guinea, riots in New Caledonia, and a new government in the Solomon Islands, and more. Today is May 31st, and welcome back to Pacific Airwaves, a podcast on the Pacific Islands from the Southeast Asia Program and the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative at CSIS. I'm Andreyka in the studio with Monica Sato from AMTI. How you doing, Monica?
Pretty good, Andreyka. Summer's coming here in DC. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling hot. It has been humid these past few days. So
Andreyka, you grew up in Indonesia, right? How is it hot here?
I left Indonesia because of the heat, and I ended up here in DC, where it is equally as humid. So that's
fair.
On me.
I mean, I'm from the Philippines, and it is equally as humid here. I came to escape the cold weather, but unfortunately, DC is just as humid as Southeast Asia.
Exactly. So anyways, let's dive straight into the news, making waves in the Pacific.
Yes, we should. In the latest news, Papua New Guinea is reeling from a deadly landslide in a remote village in the Enga province, northwest of the capital.
As many as 2,000 people and more than 150 houses are estimated to be buried under rubble.
Humanitarian workers reported that the debris stretched as far as 4 football fields. There were fears of a second landslide and disease outbreak at the disaster scene.
Monica and I extend our deepest sympathies to the victims and their families.
Over in New Caledonia, deadly riots broke out over the controversial government electoral reforms, leading to a death toll that rose to at least 7 people under a state of emergency.
Monica, could you explain to our audience what the significance is of New Caledonia?
Of course, New Caledonia is an overseas territory of France that votes for French national elections.
And the riots were due to
a new law that would extend suffrage to French residents who had lived there for 10 years to New Caledonia's electoral register. That is around 25,000 extra voters, or 10% of the resident population.
Gotcha. And so why was this controversial?
So opponents feared that this new law would dilute the political influence of the indigenous Canuck people, who make up 40% of the population.
And many Canucks have been fighting for independence from France. I recall that New Caledonia had about 3 independence referenda.
That's right, and we discussed a few actually on previous episodes of our podcast. They were held in 2018, 2020, and 2021. In the first 2 referenda, 57% and 53% voted to remain part of France.
And after the Kanak people and other pro-independence groups boycotted the third referendum, French lawmakers voted to unfreeze New Caledonia's voter list.
So how did France respond to the riots?
France sent 3,500 security officers to quell what President Emmanuel Macron called an unprecedented insurrection.
Macron also visited New Caledonia on May 22nd. He said he would not force through the contested voting reform and called on local leaders to formulate an alternative agreement. France also lifted the state of emergency.
It's tragic when political tensions escalate into violence, and we hope that there will be a resolution soon.
Likewise. Sadly, there is also unfortunate news in one of New Caledonia's neighbors, Vanuatu.
Indeed, the national air carrier Air Vanuatu went into voluntary liquidation as it owed creditors $73.5 million, a figure expected to rise.
Unfortunately, the liquidation left hundreds of seasonal workers in Australia and New Zealand stranded as they waited flights back home.
In response to the disturbance, Solomon Airlines offered air services linking Vanuatu and New Zealand starting May 27.
Speaking of Solomon Airlines, significant political changes occurred in its home turf, the Solomon Islands. Andreyka, you and Harrison discussed the April elections in the February episode. Could you give us an update?
Definitely. During the elections, former pro-Beijing Solomon Islands Prime Minister Manasseh Sogavare withdrew his candidacy after poor election results.
Andreyka, before you proceed, do you mind giving our listeners a refresher on Sogavare's relationship with China?
Of course. So under Sogavare, the Solomon Islands switched its diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 2019. In 2020, the 2 countries signed a secretive security agreement that raised concerns in Washington, Wellington, and Canberra.
That's very helpful. So who is the new prime minister of the country?
The new prime minister is Jeremiah Manele, who served as foreign minister under Sogavare's administration and has been described by media outlets as being China-friendly. Sogavare had forged a new coalition and backed Mr. Manele as the party's candidate for prime minister.
So I guess this means that the Pacific nation will remain a close partner of China.
That's right, and Manele has stated that he would continue advancing bilateral ties, including the 2022 pact.
So what were some of the regional reactions? Anthony Albanese, Australia's prime minister, was among the first to congratulate Manele, wasn't he?
That's right. And shortly after the elections, Australian Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles and New Zealand's Foreign Affairs Minister Winston Peters visited the Solomon Islands and met with the newly elected Manele.
Were there any interesting developments?
Australia pledged $33.3 million in healthcare and border control support to the island nation.
Right, and I think there was something else concerning a security review?
That's right. Marles said Manele told him that the government was undertaking a security review of the Australian police presence that had arrived at the end of 2021 to suppress anti-government protests.
The Australian police were among an international security contingent, including Fiji and New Zealand. They were due to depart in December 2023, but the Solomon Islands government requested for police presence to remain until the 2024 elections.
The review will inform both governments of the island nation's decision and whether it wishes to form a military.
We'll monitor the results of the review, so our listeners will need to stay tuned for future updates.
Certainly. And the Solomon Islands was not the only Pacific country an Australian senior official visited. On May 8, Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited Tuvalu.
And what did the two countries agree on?
The two sides signed an explanatory memorandum for the Whalapili Union Treaty. Last month, we briefly discussed the treaty, which was unaffected by the Tuvaluan elections.
Yes, the Landmark Security and Migration Pact had a contentious segment. Andreyka, what is new in this explanatory memorandum?
The memorandum emphasized that only a narrow set of circumstances for third-party cooperation would trigger a clause that allows Canberra to veto Tuvalu's security arrangements.
What else did both sides discuss?
Australia also announced a $75 million in funding for development projects in Tuvalu, including an undersea telecommunications cable and a land reclamation project to mitigate rising sea levels.
That is quadruple its financial assistance to Tuvalu, one of the three remaining Pacific countries that maintain official ties with Taiwan, alongside the Marshall Islands and Palau.
That's right. And this month, Tuvalu Prime Minister Filiti Teo, Marshall Islands President Hilda Heine, and Palau President Suranjul Whips led delegations to Taiwan to attend the inauguration of President William Lai.
All three delegations spoke of robust ties with Taiwan. However, as China becomes an increasingly important player, the issue of Taiwan's recognition continues to loom large over the region.
And now, back to the Pacific region, the Asian Development Bank published a report that expected moderate growth, 3.3% in 2024 and 4% in 2025. What are some of the factors driving this growth, Monica?
Infrastructure projects and tourism make up part of the equation. The forecast was also fueled by better prospects for the mining sector in Papua New Guinea, the largest economy in the sub-region.
Prominent challenges remain, such as labor shortages and fiscal management, while Pacific countries face growing threats from disasters and climate change.
As the pandemic recovery boost wanes and fiscal policies slowly tighten, the region inevitably runs into slower growth.
And we look forward to a better economic outlook in 2025.
And that's all we have for today.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Pacific Airwaves. Let us know what you think about our coverage by writing to our email at searadio@csis.org.
Also, our sister podcast, Southeast Asia Radio, is taking questions for their upcoming anniversary episode. Please send in questions about all things Southeast Asia to the same email.
Again, that's searadio@csis.org.
If you're not following us already, please subscribe or give us a rating on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite streaming platform.
Our producer is Marla Hiller. Special thanks to our interns Shuangling Neo and Tapi Lung for their assistance with this episode. I'm Andreyka Nasligawa.
And I'm Monica Sato.
And we'll see you next month for another episode of Pacific Airwaves.